Good morning. How are we doing this morning? We're glad that you are here with us. If you're new with us in the room, we're grateful you're here. If you're joining us online, also glad you are with us. Finishing up our series, Divine Enigma, this morning from Exodus chapter 19. Over the last few weeks, we have been producing a church podcast, and we'd love for you to be able to check that out. It kind of continues the conversation on Sunday morning, but this past Wednesday, when we released it, we spent the first 2-3 minutes talking about the Detroit Lions. How many Detroit Lion fans do we have in the room this morning? All right, many of you, okay? Many of you, and me too. If I'm going to pick a team, that would be my team. Here's the question. Do you think they're going to win a game this year if you follow them? Right, they're currently 0-7. They'll probably be 0-8 after today. They have, 8-9 games left or whatever. There's probably a high chance, in my opinion, that they're going to go winless again and set new records in the NFL. And so I don't know if you know this, but the Detroit Lions are one of the worst sports organizations of all time. Can we just agree with that? Right? It's just a true statement. Did you know since 1957, they've only won 10 games in a season 5 times? Since 1957. That's a really long time. Do you know that they only have winning records against 5 teams in the whole NFL? 5 teams. I don't know. Is there 30 teams in the NFL? I'm not sure. They have a winning record against 5 of them. Do you know that they've historically been terrible at drafting players? Do you know that they've historically had bad coaches? Coaches don't want to coach in Detroit. Do you know that at one point they had the worst GM in sports of all time in Matt Millen? Do you know this about this organization that we root for? You see, we can talk all day about the stats and the data and back up the argument that they are a terrible sports organization, yet many of us are incredibly loyal to them, right? That's our team, and we're gonna stay on the wagon because if we jump off, if they ever win, then we don't get to celebrate that, right? That's why we do this. You see, we are loyal to them because we feel like we have to. We love the Detroit Lions, but the question is, have they loved us in return? The question we want to wrestle with this morning is this: how is your loyalty affecting you? How is your loyalty affecting you? You see, many things in our life actually have our loyalty. You see, whatever has our loyalty will have a positive or negative effect on us. Whatever we're loyal to will be revealed in our actions and our attitudes. And there are often many things that have our loyalty, from our jobs and our family and our hobbies and our sports and our politics and our friendships, and on we can go about the things that we are loyal to. But isn't it true that often in our lives we are defined by the thing that has our greatest loyalty? And so then isn't it true that whatever you're loyal to often will speak to your identity? Whatever you're loyal to will often speak to the environment that you actually create. Whatever you're loyal to will often dictate the direction that you go in life. Oftentimes, we are known for what we're most loyal to. And so how is your greatest loyalty affecting you? From Exodus 19, we're going to see 3 realities of God's loyalty that I think are incredibly important for us today from Exodus 19. And here's the first, is that God's loyalty is life-altering. Let's look at verses 1 and 2 of Exodus 19. It says, on the 3rd new moon, after the people of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. They set out from Rephidim, and they came into the wilderness of Sinai, and they encamped in the wilderness. And there Israel encamped before the mountain. And so notice, we see right out of the gate that the Israelites have now been coming into the wilderness. So let's give a little timeline. This is 7 weeks after they left Egypt. This is 7 weeks after they've crossed the Red Sea. They've been in the wilderness. They set up camp, they tear down camp, they move. They set up camp, they tear down camp, and they move. You see, and they're going to be doing this. They're going to be in the wilderness for the next 40 years. And they don't really know that yet because it's because of their own sin that they will be in the wilderness. But here's what's wild about the context here of the first 2 verses of what we're seeing here, them being in the wilderness, is that over the next 40 years, 119 chapters of the Bible are going to unfold before our eyes. So while they're in the wilderness over these 40 years, from Exodus 19 all the way through Deuteronomy chapter 34, all of it happens while they're right here in the wilderness. And so they keep tearing down camp and moving forward. And so what are the people actually doing? Here's the point. They're following God in faith. And why does it take faith to follow God here? It takes faith because God did not lead them right to the promised land. Instead, he leads them into the wilderness. And so here's the crazy part. Egypt was closer to the promised land than Sinai. Egypt was closer. And so here they are, and they're wandering what could be perceived as away from the land promised to them. You see, the closer they get, the more God's going to move and do some ridiculous things. But here's the logical question that we can ask them. The question that we can ask is this: why is God bringing them the wrong way? If the direction they're heading is not getting closer to the promised land, why are they going in that direction? The answer is this: God never leads us the wrong way. He always leads us the best way. Do you believe that to be true in your life? You see, the wilderness here reveals God's loyalty to us. And so what does loyalty mean? Listen, loyalty refers to allegiance or commitment or to devotion. And so God uses the wilderness in the Israel's life and in our own life to reveal how for us he actually is. Now, here's what's also wild. We can read the first two verses and set up the context of the story, but if we're going to be honest, this context is significant to the whole Bible. In fact, these two verses here, if we look at the whole Bible from Genesis to Revelation, we would then learn this: that if Jesus doesn't pass through the desert or the wilderness, you and I are never making it to the promised land. It's never going to happen. If Jesus doesn't take the path of the cross, then our destination of eternity with God would be impossible. And so look at verse 3 and 4 with me. It says this, it says, while Moses went up to God, the Lord called to him out of the mountain, saying, thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you up on eagle's wings, and I brought you to myself. More context. Moses is about 80 years old in this text. All right, I don't know how many of you are 80 or older. Probably not many of us, maybe none of us, but the truth is Moses is about 80 years old here, and he's going to go up and down this mountain 7 or 8 times in the book of Exodus. Go talk to God, go talk to the people. Talk to God, talk to the people. Up and down the mountain, Moses is going to go. But here's what God tells Moses: I have a message that I want you to give to the people. And what is that message? The first phrase in verse 4 is this: you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians. And here's what God is saying: while you're in the wilderness, don't allow the wilderness to distract you from being focused on me. And so God is reminding them of what he's actually done in their life. You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians. Here's what God is doing. He's reminding them of grace. Of grace. And so what is grace? Listen, grace is God's riches at Christ's expense. God's riches at Christ's expense. You see, the beauty of grace is this, and God is making it abundantly clear in the message he's given the people, that you have received all the riches from me by doing nothing. And the truth is, the moment that we abandon grace, we abandon Jesus. And so if you want Jesus to stay at the center of your life, then you desperately need grace to stay at the center of your life. And why do they need grace? Listen, a few chapters later, in Exodus chapter 32, Moses is up on the mountain talking to God, and the people are at the bottom of the mountain replacing God by building an idol, and they're worshiping the idol by having a drunken orgy. Why do they need grace? Because just like you and I, they blow it, right? They make huge mistakes in what they're doing and how they're responding to God's kindness in their life. You see, so what God is doing is this: we need to talk about grace all the time, he's saying. All the time, grace needs to be on the forefront. And so let me tell you why we should never forget grace. 2 things it reminds us of. The first is this: the bad news of who I am without Jesus. And the second thing it reminds us of is the good news of who I am with Jesus. You see, the gospel reveals bad news, but it rescues with good news. And the truth is, we need God's grace. You see, it keeps us with living our life with an eternal perspective. So here's the option. You can either receive God's grace or you can reject it. The choice is yours. Most grocery stores, department stores, restaurant chains, they offer loyalty programs. So how many of you have one or up to 100 restaurant apps on your phone? Let's be honest, okay? Tons of restaurant apps, tons of loyalty programs of what we want in return. And so what's the point of a loyalty app? The point is that we would get some kind of reward, some kind of points that would build up, or we might get actually money in return. And so this week I was doing a little research on some loyalty programs, and I want to share one with you that I think you should consider. All right, and the one it's actually a department store named Neiman Marcus. Now, Neiman Marcus is a very upscale department store. I've actually never bought anything from the store. In fact, when I lived in Raleigh, North Carolina, there was an anchor store, the Neiman Marcus there. And so I went out from inside the mall. I went and saw the sign and the entrance into the store, and they had this sales sign out front with these shoes on these tables. And I went to look at the shoes, and they were 50% off, and they were still $1,100. And so I then realized I'm going to turn around and walk away, all right? This is not the store for me. But it might be the store for you. So let me share a few loyalty program offers that they have for you to really encourage good spending in their store. It has 3 levels, 3 tiers to their loyalty program. The base level, just like the bottom, like kind of loser status, is if you spend $5,000 in their store, they will give you free gift wrapping. It's awesome, right? It's so generous. It's so kind. So think about it. Christmas is coming up. It's going to be November 1st. It's kind of getting close to Christmas season. So if you spend $5,000 in the next 6 weeks, they'll wrap all your gifts for you for free. Are you blown away? But there's more tiers. We're going to jump a little bit. Here's tier 2. Tier 2 is not $5,000. Tier 2 is a minimum of $75,000, and the gap is up to $600,000 is tier 2, all right? So if you have $75,000 that you want to spend at Neiman Marcus, or up to $600,000, there's some special offers for you, and that offer is that you will get private shopping hours. Plus you get the free gift wrapping. Isn't that amazing? But wait, there's more. There's the 3rd level of Neiman Marcus loyalty program. All right, and that is this. If you spend north of $600,000, we need to have a meeting, me and you, if that's you. But if you spend north of $600,000 at this store, you will get unparalleled access to the store. Meaning, I think that might equal a key to a store that you're practically already living in, right? Plus, you get private shopping hours, and also, still, you get free gift wrapping. Loyalty programs. Loyalty programs. You see, the point of the loyalty program is if you spend a certain amount of money, you get. You see, they're trying to offer you good news. And isn't it interesting that every loyalty program in the world, first and foremost, depends upon your loyalty to the store. So if you're loyal, in return, you will receive certain amount of points, rewards, or gifts. Listen, only in the gospel do you actually get the good news that God's loyalty to you precedes your loyalty to Him. It's only in Him do we find it. All the reward programs in the world are about you being loyal first. Only in the gospel does God grant His loyalty to you before He ever asks for your loyalty in return. So look back at verse 4 again with me. It says, "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and I brought you to myself." Listen, God is telling them more about His grace. Not only did you see what I did to your enemy, I bore you on eagle's wings. I brought you to myself. Like, notice the gracious phrases, I bore and I brought. You see, an eagle's a very interesting creature to think about because typically it's a bird of prey. Right? So here's the point, is that the Egyptians were the prey and Israel was to be rescued. And so what's the point then of God using this analogy of bringing an eagle with its wings? The point is this, is that, hey people, hey Israel, you did nothing to be rescued. I did all of the work. Notice in the text, God says, I bore, I brought. Notice what it doesn't say. It doesn't say that Israel put forward an amazing performance. Notice what it doesn't say. It doesn't say that Israel put on their running shoes and they outran the Egyptians at a 4:4 speed. Notice what it doesn't say. It doesn't say the Egyptians or the Israelites had awesome fighting skills and they outfought the enemy themselves. You see, none of that's what actually happened. God is saying this to Israel. Here's the point of the story. You are not the hero. You are not the eagle. I, in my grace, I have saved you and rescued you. Are you blown away by God's grace in your life? God's grace is life-altering. And we've said it before, and I'll say it again. If grace doesn't change you, it doesn't save you. How is your greatest loyalty affecting you? Three realities of God's loyalty. We've seen the first, it's life-altering. But second, God's loyalty is life-defining. Look at verse 5 with me. It says, now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. So notice the first two words there. We have the word now and the word therefore. So these two words are connecting everything that's been previously established in Exodus chapter 19 and before. So because of grace, because of the eagle, because I am the Lord, what is God saying? Because I have given you loyalty, what is God saying your response should be? Obey my voice, listen to my commands, be loyal in return. Be loyal in return. You see, all this text is telling us about is the relationship that God desires to have with his people. And this is how his relationships work. I grant grace, I rescue, I work, I move, and then you respond. How? You respond with great clarity, very specific, with obedience, with loyalty. By the way, the order of these verses is incredibly important. And what's happening in Exodus 19 is actually unpacked all over the Bible. We're seeing this, what I would call a sequence of grace, right? A gospel sequence. And that gospel sequence has a specific order, and that order is this. It's grace, obedience, blessing. It's grace, obedience, blessing, and nothing must ever change this order. Now here's the problem. When we use the word gospel, some of you think law instead of grace. And by the way, that's an eternity-altering difference. It's what Satan desires you to think versus what Jesus desires you to think. And the reason we often think law instead of gospel or instead of grace is because we've been told our whole life in West Michigan what to do without the motivation as to why we should actually do it, which is God's grace and God's loyalty in your own life. And so guess what happens? Because we view it as law instead of gospel, we actually change the order. We change the sequence. So the sequence is no longer grace, obedience, blessing, but the sequence is obedience, grace, blessing. How do you view it in your life? Because it's an eternity-altering difference. In other words, it's I obey so I can be accepted. Or is your view, I'm accepted, so therefore I obey. You see, God's loyalty is so incredibly important to us. And I want you to understand something, that his loyalty to you is not actually based on you, but it's based on a decision that he made about you. And so then we respond with loyalty in return. Now here's what's wild. Isn't it crazy? In Exodus 20, God's gonna give them the law, the 10 commandments. And isn't it wild that God did not give them the law first before he rescued them? While they're slaves in Egypt for 4 centuries, 400 years, God didn't go to them with his eagle, have it fly around all of Egypt and say, hey, the moment you start obeying me, I will send in my bird and I will rescue you in my grace. That's not what God actually did. God said this, you've seen what I did. I bore you up on eagle's wings. That was my eagle. Here's the biblical point. God does not have a tendency of telling us what to do without first and foremost reminding us of what it is that he's already done. You see, God is about relationship. And the relationship he wants with you precedes the giving of the law. Listen, if you want to understand the whole Bible from Genesis to Revelation, you got to get this right. It's grace, obedience, blessing. It is not obedience, grace, blessing. And so what then is your view of the gospel? Is your view, I obey so I can be accepted? Because if that's you, when the wilderness moments come in your life, you're going to be infuriated with God. Why? Because you're going to say, God, I've been good. I've been obeying, and this is how you're going to repay me? That's what that view does. It leads to frustration and anger with the Lord. We have to get this right. I'm accepted, so therefore I obey. And again, the crazy part for the Israelites is God did not tell them to obey before he rescued them. He rescued them and then calls for their obedience. Grace is a life-defining gift. Another way to look at grace is this: it's actually an unconditional acceptance granted from an unobligated giver. He's given you unconditional acceptance, and that grace comes from someone who's not obligated to actually give you anything. So do you realize that grace defines every part of who I am? And so what are the results of grace? Listen, we can talk about a position change. We can talk about a status change that we see in the scriptures. It changes who you are. It changes what you do, meaning this: no longer is my life defined by what I do. You see, it's who I am that determines what I do now. It's not what I do that determines who I am. And those two views are incredibly important to understand, and that's what's happening here in the text. So I guess the question that I've been wrestling with all week in this story is, how does God view me? Do you ever wrestle with that? How does God actually view me? But it's here in verse 6 that we see three blessings. We've talked about grace. We've seen God calls for our obedience, but then the blessing comes, and I want you to see the blessing. Let me speak to your heart, because the first thing that God says in verse 6 is that you, or verse 5, is that you will be my treasured possession among all peoples. Listen, if you know Christ, you are his treasured possession. Listen, this is referring to what a king values most in everything that he has at his disposal. You are God's greatest treasure. By the way, at the end of that verse in verse 5, it says, for all that's in the earth is mine, meaning God could choose anything he wants to treasure, anything that he spoke into being, and what he's choosing are those who are his own. I choose you, he says. You are mine. I choose friendship and relationship with you. You see, what is God's most treasured possession? The answer is you. What does God delight in most in the world? The answer is you. Who does God desire the greatest friendship and relationship with? The answer is you. God is saying he treasures you and your relationship with you above everything else that he created. That's incredible. But here's the crazy part. In his grace, he actually grants more than that. He also tells us that we are a kingdom of priests. Listen, priests are mediators, and we see Moses giving us that analogy. He's going up the mountain to talk to God, down to the people to give the message. He's going between God and the people, which then means that every one of us who is a treasured possession of the Lord, you have access to God's throne whenever you want it. You're treasured. You're valued. You are a kingdom of priests, that you live your life with mission in mind, and we get to represent the king with whatever we do. And so, of course, when people see the church, the capital C church in the world, they should see Jesus, because that's what priests actually do. We display and declare Jesus. Do you realize if you know Christ, you have access to his throne of grace whenever you want it? But friends, here's the crazy part. There's actually more. Not only are you a treasured possession, not only are you a kingdom of priests, but we also see this, that we make up this thing called a holy nation. A holy nation. What's the word holy mean? It means to be separate. It means to be distinct. It means to be set apart. And so what is God doing? We'll see, and you see in Exodus 20 going forth, that God actually sets forward a new kind of society. That every one of us who's a treasured possession, who's a kingdom of priests, we make up this holy nation, that we have a citizenship that's not of this world, but it's actually of a place where the holy king is actually reigning. Now put yourself in the shoes of the Egyptians for a moment. All they've known for 4 centuries is slavery. Generational slavery is all they've known. And so here now they have this God who's rescued them, telling them he's forming a new kind of society, a new kind of nation, and they have to be thinking, what in the world are you talking about? Here's the point. In God's grace, he changes their identity, which then absolutely changes the goals. You see, without grace and without Jesus, the goals in the world that we live in are all about pleasure, possessions, are all about money, it's all about sex, it's all about the glory of yourself. Like, that's what the world is that we live in. But what God is saying in this holy nation, it's about the glory of him. That those who are his treasured possessions, those who are kingdom of priests, they make up this holy nation with this citizenship where we get to represent our king. And so the way in which we live as citizens is the way that Jesus gets his way in our hearts and in our lives. Do you realize this is how God views you? But isn't it true, if we can be honest, that we so often want God to view us in such a way that he's looking through the lens of our own mess? God, why is it that you're not defining me what I did this week? Oh God, I blew it again. Please, God, don't view me through that lens. And here's the point. God's view of you is not based on you. Again, it's based on a decision that he made about you. And so in verse 7 and 8, it says that Moses came down from the mountain and he came to all the people and told them what God said. And the people answered together in the verse, and they say, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. We will do. How do the people respond? We're all in, God. Yes, we will be obedient because God's grace is ridiculous in our life. Listen, what's your response going to be? Because God asks you the same thing. And I can't help but wonder what blessings we often miss out on our life because we're unwilling to actually surrender our lives to him. How is your greatest loyalty affecting you? Through realities of God's loyalty, here's the third we'll see, is that God's loyalty is life-giving. Look at verse 9 with me. It says, and the Lord said to Moses, behold, I am coming to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with them, and may also believe you forever. And when Moses told the words of the people to the Lord said to Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their garments and be ready for the 3rd day. For on the 3rd day the Lord will come down to Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. Wait, what? Listen, God has demonstrated loyalty to the people, but the question is, who is this God who's been loyal to the people? And it starts out by saying, behold, to stop, to stare, to gaze at what? He says this, I am coming to you. Why? So when I speak to you, Moses, the people can actually hear what I say to you forever. And we know this, that relationships historically are built on communication. You see, he's going to speak with the people, so they have to listen. They have to listen. So look what it says in verse 12. This story gets crazy. And it says this, and you shall set limits for all the people, saying, take care not to go up the mountain or touch the edge of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death. No hand shall touch it, but he shall be stoned or shot. Whether beast or man, he shall not live. And when the trumpet sounds a long blast, they shall come up to the mountain. So Moses went down from the mountain to the people and consecrated the people, and they washed their garments. Listen, what does it mean in verse 12 when it says set limits? It's true that we all have limits in our life, right? There's things we can do, things we can't do. But here's the point. God desires a relationship with you, and he desires a relationship with his people, but you don't approach holiness on your terms. You don't get to decide how you're going to approach the Lord. Holiness cannot be approached lightly. And so we're seeing this tension about a God who desires relationship with the people, a God who's unapproachable, but yet he wants us to approach him. Now let's be honest, I don't know one adult who enjoys going to the dentist. Anybody? Right? Some of you enjoy going to the dentist. That's wild to me, all right? My kids love going to the dentist. They absolutely love it. I can't stand going to the dentist. In fact, I always make an appointment when I leave, and then when it comes like the week before or a few days before, they text me or call me to remind me of the appointment that's coming, and what's the first thing I do? I reschedule it every single time because I look at my calendar, and I'm like, I don't have time for this. Like, I don't have time to give him time to be in my presence today. My calendar's too busy. Too much is going on, and isn't it true that when we want to go see the dentist, we need it to be convenient for us, right? I need it to work out for me. I need to decide when it's best. Listen, when I look at this text, there doesn't seem to be any contract negotiation going on. There's no let's make a deal kind of stuff. God says, these are the terms, and I can't help but wonder, how often do we approach a holy God lightly? You see, what's being offered to these people is to come to the mountain to bask in God's holiness. That's amazing. God says this, I'm coming down to you. By the way, is that not the reality of the gospel? I'm coming to you. Listen, I think our half-hearted approaches to God would often fade away if we realized and understood the God that we're actually approaching. He's other than us. He's different. Holiness dictates how he is to be approached. God gets to set the limits because holiness trumps our lives. In fact, we can go back to verse 2. Look at the last phrase of verse 2 with me. It says this. It says, there Israel encamped before the mountain. Some translations say this, front of the mountain. I don't know if you know this, but mountains don't have fronts, but thrones do. And so the people are called to approach God on the mountain like people would approach the subjects would approach a king who reigns in all authority. And so that's what we're seeing here, how they're moving towards the mountain. You see, how did God decide that they should approach him? What are the limits? He said, consecrate yourself, wash your garments, don't touch the mountains, don't walk up the mountains. If you do, I will put you to death. I will stone you, or he says, I will shoot you. And I don't know what that means when God says that back in this time. Like, he's going to shoot somebody, he says. Like, this is wild. In other words, God is saying this, you have no authority here. You don't decide how this is going to go. And we're seeing an amazing gospel fact here, and that is this, is that the grace that's been extended to us has a whole new meaning when we understand the God who's actually extended it. Listen, if you are to feel the wonder of God's grace in your life, then you first must feel the terror of his holiness. And so how does the story play out? Look at verse 16 with me. Here comes the day. God's going to come down to the people. And it says in verse 16, on the morning of the third day, there were thunders and lightning and a thick cloud on the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God. They took their stand at the foot of the mountain, and now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because of the Lord had descended on it in fire. The smoke of it went up like a smoke of kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. And as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder. And the Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. I wonder what the people expected. God said this, in 3 days, I'm going to come down on the mountain. And I wonder what that buildup was like for those 3 days. What were the people thinking? Were they following all the rules that God asked them to follow? And then on the third day, there's this loud trumpet sound. There's this thunder. There's this thick cloud gathering around the mountain. The whole thing is wrapped in smoke because the whole mountain is on fire. I feel like the trumpet blasting. It says it's getting louder and louder. It must have been plug your ears kind of loud. And what was the response of the people? It's the only biblical response there is. They trembled. They trembled. They were afraid. Is it possible that this could be one of the most frightening scenes in the entire Bible? They're shaking in fear. This is the only appropriate response to the holiness of the Lord. Holiness has a voice. And then it said this in the text, you just see it, that Moses brought the people out to meet God. Come, everybody. Like, let's come to the mountain. Listen, no introduction was necessary. He didn't have to read off God's resume. Like, they knew with great clarity who they were approaching in that moment. And not only did the people tremble in fear, but we saw in the text that the mountain itself trembled and shook greatly. And so what we're seeing is that this fear of God produces an awe of God, and it keeps us from sin. And we see that here in the text. God said, don't run up the mountain, don't touch the mountain. If you do, I'm going to shoot you. You see, that holiness created a barrier to say, I'm going to obey, I'm going to listen to this guy. And here they are, running face to face with holiness. You see, the people in the mountain were afraid of God's holiness. Why? Because they learned very clearly what they were. They realized this is not their fire, this is not their smoke, these are not their trumpets, this is not their mountain. They're learning a lot about who this God is. And when we learn about who God is, it exposes with great clarity all that we are. They realize they are nothing. Like, they're in trouble. You see, mountaintop experiences, I believe, give us courage for the season, in the next season in the wilderness. And if I give us a gospel takeaway, I would say it this way, is that God's loyalty compels our greatest awe. God's loyalty compels our greatest awe. You see, God's loyalty, we've seen it is life-altering, it is life-defining, it is life-giving to help you realize who you are and what you're not. But here's the point. Greater than the Red Sea that was crossed by the Israelites, when God said in Exodus 14:14, I will fight for you, you only have to be silent. And greater, and then what we see in Joshua 6 with Jericho, where the walls came down with trumpets, and greater than Baal being defeated, and greater than God holding the sun still so the Israelites can win a victory in battle, and greater than what took place in the fiery furnace in Daniel chapter 3 when they walked out of the fire with no injuries, and greater than this mountain shaking in Exodus chapter 19 because of the holiness of the Lord is an empty tomb for you and I. The tomb is empty. Victory's been granted. Is a church full of sinful people that gather weekly to worship Jesus, is relationships that we can have to be nurtured to compel our joy in Him, is the Word of God that we have that we can press into daily to be reminded of the good news of the gospel, is a church community that can be centered on the gospel, is a marriage and a home that we can have where Jesus actually reigns, is the motivation we now have because of the tomb to shred the sin that so easily entangles, is the mission that we all get to live on with great unity that gives us purpose and privilege in our life to bring heaven to earth. You see, we have so much at our disposal that should motivate our awe and joy of the Lord, that all is based on the tomb being empty. And so we can look at this series and see how God moved into ridiculous things all in Israel's past. Man, it'd be awesome if God would show up for me in that way. And I want to be abundantly clear, God has done more than move mountains for you. The grave is empty, and the realities of the grave live out with us today in our life. Do you know that? Do you understand that? And so the question is, will you stand in awe of God? Will you stand in awe of God today? We can talk about this divine enigma kind of guy who did all these things to bring heaven to earth, yet what he's saying is this: I'm making you a treasured possession, I'm making you a holy nation. Listen, you are a citizen of my kingdom, you are my people, and so guess what happens? How his church lives actually brings heaven to earth. And so what an awesome responsibility we have to get to do that together. Do you agree? Are you blown away by God's holiness? Because here's what happens. When we encounter holiness, it melts our hearts. And it helps us realize, man, how sinful we really are, but it also reveals how loved we are by a God who has no business granting us anything of kindness. And so as we close this series this morning, we're going to sing a few songs. And our heart is to respond to the Lord and His goodness and kindness towards us. That as we leave here today, let's have a greater sense of awe of who God is based on what His Word declares. Let's pray. Jesus, I want to thank You for Your Word, and thank You for loving people like us. And thank You for the fact that you are a holy God and that we can actually know you and have a relationship with you, that you make yourself understandable through the attributes you have that describe you in the Bible. And so, Lord, we know you by your character. We know you by your love and your grace and your kindness and your compassion and your faithfulness to us, Lord, your forgiveness that you grant us. These are the avenues that this divine enigma, Lord, becomes more clear in our hearts and our lives because we know you through the things and the gifts that you, and the ways that you grant us these things. And so my heartbeat is, Lord, that Redemption Church will be a place where a spiritual hospital where those who don't have it all figured out can gather together, Lord, in our own brokenness, but weekly to get refocused on you again, to embrace the glory of all that you are, Lord, to be blown away by your holiness, Lord. Everything that's important in our life melts at the bottom of this mountain when we come in contact with you. And so I pray, Lord, that you will move in our hearts in specific ways. In your name, amen.